Now, it is with great pleasure for me to introduce Nozipho Tshabalala, CEO of the Conversation Strategist, who will be leading our next panel discussion on the topic, prioritizing education in financing decisions. Nozi, the last time we shared a stage together was at the Forbes Women Africa Leading Women Summit. Great to have you back.
Thank you so much. It's always lovely to be back home at CNBC Africa. Certainly one of the stages that I always consider home, and to be hosting such an important conversation on the financing of education. Now, we do know that the global pandemic has really impacted the perception and the mindset to financing education. And so in this conversation, we're going to unpack all of that and really begin to think about how do we make education part of the recovery pathway. But before we get started, we do have a short background package to set the scene for our discussion. Have a look.
Before the crisis hit, low and middle income countries already faced an education funding gap of $1.5 trillion a year. This gap has now grown. Education budgets need to be protected and increased, and it is critical that education is at the heart of international solidarity efforts, from debt management and stimulus packages to global humanitarian appeals and official development assistance. Solutions can come through government education budgets, public-private partnerships, development assistance, and private equity investments. Private markets offer an opportunity to invest in projects that contribute to economic and social development objectives. Some projects target specific social development objectives, such as providing quality education.
Let's meet our panel of experts bringing their voices, their insights, and their experiences into this conversation.
Dr. Kingsley Nyako, Ghana Member of Parliament for Kwadaso constituency and former Executive Secretary of the Ghana National Accreditation Board. Eric Idiahi, co-founder and partner at Verod Capital. Professor Alda Dutoy from the Department of Financial Management at the University of Pretoria. And the moderator is Nozipho Tshabalala, CEO at the Conversation Strategist.
It's a big welcome to you, Kingsley, Eric, and Elda. And perhaps, Elda, I'm going to come to you first just for us to begin to scope and get an understanding of the impact of the COVID-19 crisis on education funding more specifically. What has been the impact on education funding?
Thank you, Nozipho. Yes, it has been great. If I can first speak about the impact on education itself, tertiary institutions had to suddenly make teaching online available to everyone. And you would think in the 21st century this is very possible, but we need to remember we are an emerging economy. So we cannot assume that all our students have internet access. We cannot assume everyone has electronic devices such as laptops or tablets. And internet access is not available everywhere. And in addition, our students had to leave their residences, go back home, maybe to less than ideal home situations. So the list goes on and on in terms of education in general. In terms of education funding, this has become a real crisis. I have first-hand experience of students who had to drop out of their studies because they just could not finance it anymore. And the 2021 National Student Financial Aid Scheme, which we generally know as NSFAS, exceeded 750,000 applications. That is 185,000 more than it was in 2020. So this universities have to help more students. The students don't have funding. Even the university model in terms of subsidy from the government has to change now, because we are not in effect residential at the moment. We are teaching distance education. Parents don't want to pay necessarily a residential education fee where we are teaching distance education online. So it just stacks up and becomes more and more of a problem the longer this COVID situation is going on.
Elda, I think that's a fantastic scoping by really just speaking to us about what the impact on higher education in particular really has been like. I do want to just maybe follow up with you before we actually get, into how we fund. You spoke about how the funding model needs to be different from here on because, as you said, you're not residential anymore. What are the conversations like between the sector and government? What are the conversations like between the sector and private investors, as an example? Is there an openness to this new way of education that we are likely never going to get away from? Because I don't see a scenario where education goes back to be fully residential like it was before.
Yes, that is definitely true. We are at the least going to have a hybrid system in future. At this stage, we are just trying to stay ahead, try to get funding, try to cope with the funds we have. So between the private sector and the university, not much has happened yet. And between government and the university, the government has a lot to cope with at the moment. So funding for higher education is not really a priority at the moment. So we are facing a few problems in future.
Yeah, Elda, that's fantastic. I mean, there are two hypotheses there that we're going to invite both Kingsley and Eric to test. Eric from the perspective of the private sector, and again going to Kingsley to look at the perspective of government and using Ghana as an example. But Eric, let me go to you first. I mean, we know that Virad is already investing in education. When you look at the impact of the pandemic on the education sector, has that influenced your mindset to funding education or your philosophy to investing in the education sector at all?
I think the key word there for us is technology, in a sense. Pre the pandemic, we're very active in investing in the space. But post the pandemic, I think any investment we do in the space, if it's not technology enabled in a sense, we won't consider it. So technology has been a massive change for us. It's been a big change in our mindset, in that any investments we make in the technology sector has to have a big technology component to it, where there could be an online component in terms of education, providing education online, or using technology or various technological tools to provide that education. And we've seen one of the things we did with our investments is that we helped a lot of them pivot, or encourage a lot of them to pivot to a more hybrid solution of providing education.
So you're speaking about education, about technology being a differentiator now in your investment strategy. But what about the reality, Eric, that Elda has raised to say, look, whether you're looking at South Africa or any other market in West Africa or East Africa or Central Africa, we do have this reality of a digital divide. We do know that there is deep inequality in terms of accessing online education or technology-based education. How do we ensure that as technology becomes the differentiator, that we're not leaving learners and students behind in the process?
So government plays a big role in that. So of course, I mean, you have the private sector like us investing, but for education to be successful anywhere in the world, government has to play also a very important role. In Nigeria, where we have a few investments, there are a few examples of state governments that have done a lot to provide data access or partnered with telcos to provide free data and different services to the bottom of the pyramid or low-income students, to give them access to I guess, technology or distribution of data or information for their learnings. So it's very, very important for government to also play a strong role in making sure that we deliver education across Africa. The private sector can't do it without government support.
Yeah, absolutely, Eric. I mean, we will circle back to public-private partnerships and also how might they need to be reconfigured in this new era so that we are able to deliver education at the last mile for every learner across the continent. But let me go to Ghana. Let me go to Dr. Kingsley. Dr. Kingsley, let's pull in the Ghanaian experience and ask you, what has been the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on Ghana's education system specifically?
Yeah, so as we see across the globe, Ghana has also received its fair share of the impact of COVID-19 on our school system. So if you look at access and participation of education in the country, there have been some problems. Access has been affected uh, because of the closures of schools, and especially the vulnerable groups and those in rural areas. They had difficulties accessing education because of lack of internet facilities and funds for them to receive education, even though the government did her best by providing learning through the digital platforms on TV and radio. But those who don't have access in rural areas and deprived communities didn't benefit from education. And again, we've also seen that parents lost their jobs and businesses and all that, and because of that, they couldn't even provide educational goods and services for their children, and this also affected the country in some other ways. When it comes to impacts of COVID-19 on learning, we saw a disruption to learning across all levels because the children stayed at home about 10 months, and especially those at the basic schools suffered. We are also talking about lack of physical contact hours between the learners and the teachers. And for example, 60% of children were engaged in learning during their time at home. 60%. The question is, what about the 40%? What did they do? So these are some of the issues that confronted our school system, and especially teachers. Public school teachers were lucky. They received their salaries and their wages and their compensation, but those in private schools had issues, because these institutions are self-funded. They didn't get the needed resources. Some had to quit. Some didn't come back when schools reopened. So, by and large, the COVID-19 had a egregious effect on us. However, the government also put in very good interventions, at least to protect life, to protect children, and to keep the school running. So even though there were issues, we were able to weather the storm in a way to ensure that the school system didn't completely jeopardize. So I think that COVID-19 also, apart from this negative impact on our school system, also exposed us regarding what we have to do differently, interventions we have to put in our school system. For example, it exposed us in terms of infrastructure, classrooms that were inadequate and all that, us not having robust ICT infrastructure.
Yeah.
All these are positive impacts that we have to learn from. If you are able to put all these interventions in place, establishing a robust ICT infrastructure,
Yeah.
building more infrastructure, classrooms, and all that, I think that it will help us to do things differently moving forward. So it's true that COVID-19 impacted on us negatively, but in a way, positively, there are lessons that we learned, and some interventions that we put in place
Kingsley,
to the school move on.
Kinsley, I want to maybe just double click on those lessons because, again, I've heard you speaking about the lessons have been learned, and I want to bring in a little bit of what Elder started us off with, which is this idea that we're going to have to start funding differently. So I'm keen to understand from your perspective, what from a budgeting perspective, from a funding perspective, what is Ghana doing differently in the education sector, if at all?
Okay, so as we speak, government has been funding education from its own sources, largely from government of Ghana, budgetary allocation, from internally generated fund, and all that. But because of COVID, as we speak, Ghana has not put in place specific intervention of funding regime to fund our school system. What the government has done is that there have been introduction of new taxes, and these new taxes are supposed to increase our resource envelope. And we believe that when that is done, we will get additional resources to channel into our school system. I mean, we put some taxes on, health sector recovery, the banking sector, sanitation, and all that. And we believe that the expanded resource envelope will help us to be able to fund, educational goods and services. So government is looking at all available options, and don't forget that within this COVID era, there's burden on governments.
Yeah.
People have lost their jobs and all that. So any intervention has to be gradual. You need to first make sure that the fundamentals of the economy are strong. You have to bring the economy back on track. I mean, create jobs and all that. And when these are done, and you want to introduce any additional burden on the citizens to get more resources into education, then complaints will be minimized. Because if you're not careful and you begin to bring in more burden on citizens, there are going to be agitations and all that. And this can destabilize governments. So I believe that we have to make sure that the funding gap in education is closed. But we must be circumspect in doing that. Otherwise, there will be negative consequences from society.
Kingsley, I'm going to pause you there. I'm going to just pause you there for a second, because I think you've raised something very important. And Elder, I want to come to you with this question. Listening to Kingsley's response and this idea that we need to be very careful about the sequencing of the recovery, that it needs to be the recovery of the economy, it needs to be the creation of jobs before we get to education. I would be very keen to hear your reaction to that, because a part of what we've been hearing is that this is an economic and health crisis. But listening in on this conversation and the impact and the long-term impact on the education sector, one would imagine that education needs to be a priority and that the sequencing needs to be interrogated. What are your thoughts?
Yes, I definitely agree with you that we cannot put education on the back burner while we are looking at other issues. I know that other issues are important. Health, getting the economy back on track, that is important. But there is a bit of a lack of concern. There is in our South African Economic Reconstruction and Recovery Plan, I could not find any allocation for education, especially higher education. And our Director of Institutional Planning at the University of Pretoria, Gerald van Genge Oma, recently wrote in the Conversation South Africa that countries such as Denmark, France, Taiwan, Colombia, Indonesia, so even our emerging economies in the world, are providing funding support for universities or students in response to COVID-19. While South Africa's reprioritization budget reduced planned expenditure for higher education, including the NSFAS scheme. So this is difficult to understand, seeing that we project significant job losses and more students will need support. If you even look at the US, already in March last year, they passed a bill that allocated approximately $14 billion to higher education through an emergency relief fund, specifically for the COVID situation that we're in. So for me, this is really concerning. I do understand we have to prioritize health and welfare. There's people who are really struggling, but we cannot ignore education. We need educated people to fill important jobs in future.
Yeah, it's such an incredible debate that we're having, because one of the words that I think Kingsley used, which is interesting, is the phrase was, burden on government. And I think that's where we potentially need to begin to interrogate our mindset, to say, is this an opportunity for governments and private sector in partnership to fund education differently and have a systemic impact on the future that we're marching towards? Or are we going to see education as a burden and the funding of education as a burden? And what are the consequences of that? Maybe the question, just a very quick follow-up question to you, Elder, is just as at a broad scan, you've already made the point that in South Africa, there was almost zero allocation to higher education in the recovery plan. How does that compare to trends on the continent or around the world? Is this something that is evident elsewhere, that we have forgotten education and maybe even higher education in the recovery conversation?
Yes, definitely. I cannot really speak for the continent of Africa, but definitely on an international scale. We are not prioritizing education, and there is just no plan for supporting our students, supporting our universities with everything that they need.
No, that's and of course that's a worrying trend that we need to be keeping our eye on because of those long-term effects. So Eric, I do want to come to you, because I think for the most part of this conversation now we've been focusing on the challenge and the impact of the pandemic. Let's switch gears now and begin to talk about some opportunities to really fund. What about the private markets? What about the private markets? Can they be better leveraged to access funding for education?
So I think there are two parts to that. On the private market, you have, of course, private players like myself who invest in education. But I would like to reiterate that for that to be successful in today's times, government needs to also play a role. So on the private side, there are different kind of funding instruments that we can provide to fund education, fund private education. But there's a broader scale in the market, in the sense that you also need to target every aspect of the economy, every aspect of the social, economic, geographic in that sense. So, but in doing that, government support is critical. We've started exploring things like social bonds of impact bonds in that sense. We're partnering with also institutions like CDC or FMO, the larger institutions that provide DFI funding and impact funding. So I think it's not a one-size-fits-all. It's something that needs to be done in combination with the private sector and governments to create those unique funding instruments for them.
Yeah, and certainly the point you've made also earlier, Eric, is around those public-private partnerships, and that government also needs to come to the party. I wonder, though, if we look at trends, Eric, whether we can see a pattern of a growth in private sector-led education assets, whether it is primary schools, secondary schools, or tertiary institutions that are actually outside of the scope of government control, and whether you see this as an emerging opportunity in the market that we could also be looking to, given some of the slowness we've seen in government to deliver. Could we see private players go more aggressively into education, given the fact that the demand is not going to go away with an increase and growth in the population?
So we've seen a lot of that in the last 5-6 years in Africa. Companies like Bridge has come in and provided great services at affordable prices, and we see a lot of that also on the higher echelons of the market. We've at Verot have invested a bit in K-12, also university education, and we're going to continue to see that. And with technology also, I think what Bridge has done, and I feel like companies we've seen have done, is really use technology as a way to also make it cheaper to deliver education. And as you see more innovation in the markets, you're going to see a lot of that also changing the way investors approach that space. And a lot more of those will translate into more and more investments, and a push for private sector to make profits from education. So the short answer to that is yes, you're going to see an increase in that in the next couple of years.
Absolutely. And of course, you spoke about social bonds as just one of the financial instruments that could be more effectively used. What results have you had with social bonds, and what do you think the scope is for them to be even more effectively used in the market?
We're just working on one. I've been involved in one in the past, and currently trying to do that on the firm-wide basis. With some success. In other cases, we've not had great success. I guess in markets, when we started it a few years ago, was not the right time for it. But I think now there are a lot more opportunities to deploy in that space. But more interesting, I think there's also a massive interest from the foreign markets and DFIs and impact investors who see that as a way to give back to the community. Or to Africa in that sense, and are willing to participate and invest in these bonds. So I think the market is just beginning. I think the next 3 or 4 years, you're going to see a rush of those social bonds and things like that facilitates investing in education.
That's really interesting. As you speak about, DFIs potentially even stepping more into this opportunity and unlocking financing from that perspective. And I want to come back to you, Kingsley, because I think I'd love to hear your voice reacting to that particular suggestion. But let's talk just a little bit around whether the government of Ghana has sought to look at private markets as one of the pools out of which it can source funding for education. And what are your thoughts on what Eric has just put on the table, that we potentially could see markets opening up, more players like DFIs coming forward, more international players or foreign players coming in to participate? Would Ghana be open to business in that regard?
Of course, but before I go further, I want to indicate that our budget for this year increased by 40% as compared to last year's figure. We made a budgetary allocation for education of about $2.6 billion, equivalent to 15 billion Ghana cedis. And we believe that this is a step in the right direction, even though its percentage share to our total budget was about 12.1%, a drop from the previous 15%. For us, we know that leveraging the private sector in supporting educational development is key. Government alone cannot shoulder the responsibility, especially in African countries. You realize that our economies are depressed. Most African countries are saddled with debt and all that. I'm not saying that we need to put education on the back burner. Obviously, education must be on the front burner, but we need to be strategic in our approach. We need to do targeted investment so that we don't end up burdening African economies. For me, that is very important. The need to go for social bonds is okay for us if we can invest in critical sectors within the education environment. Because COVID-19 has exposed us. It has made us to know that there are inadequacies in our school system. And if we want to progress as a continent, if we want our respective countries to grow, then we need to invest hugely in education. But in doing so, as I said earlier on, we have to be very careful. In my constituency, for example, even in the midst of COVID, when they call me, they are asking for their roles to be faced. They are asking for their roles to be faced. They're not even talking about education. I don't think that they don't value education, but they feel that that is also a need that must be met. So leveraging the private sector in terms of social bond and all that are laudable. That is where I think that we have to go. And again, because of the debt burden on African countries, I want to suggest that there should be a period of debt forgiveness or cancellation for African countries, especially those that are very depressed and vulnerable. Or these debt cancellations or forgivenesses could be targeted in investment in certain aspects of education development in our respective countries. Okay, for us, This will help us to grow our education, to build more human capacity, to develop our manpower, to identify talents in order to propel our respective countries forward. Ghana did so well in the midst of COVID. So many investment. Teachers sat at home for about a year, but they still received their salary. Okay, in the midst of lack of productivity, in the midst of dwindling resource envelopes, because the government thinks well of education, teachers were still paid. Even in private institutions, government provided stimulus packages, not even for all of them. Some of them benefited. The idea was to keep them educating our human resource that we need to make progress as a nation.
So, Kingsley, I want to maybe just pause on a point that you've made. I must say that it's a part of the conversation that I haven't heard in the global conversation in relation to funding as part of the recovery path out of this global pandemic, and this idea that we could potentially should be looking at the cancellation of debt around specific sectors, education being the one that is case in point right now. How is that conversation going? In which global spaces is this conversation taking place? And maybe as one African to another, to ask the courageous question whether that plays into the perception that Africa will always want to be bailed out instead of raising its own competitiveness to attract investment from the rest of the world, instead of borrowing and then wanting that debt to be cancelled. And I ask this question simply because it would not be the first time in Africa's history that debt cancellation is a conversation that is on the table. To you, please, Kingsley.
Yeah, so, we've talked about a whole lot of solutions that will help us to fund education. I just talked about leveraging the private sector in terms of raising bonds and all that, but that cannot be the only solution. I also talked about investment in productive sectors of the economy in terms of building our human capital. But I'm also saying that the pandemic brought untold hardships on most countries, especially developing ones and emerging economies. And these are facts. And the point is that we have to find a way of asking our donors that because of the extraordinary situation that we find ourselves in, they should think about forgiving, because this debt that is being ballooned largely was due to the pandemic. And I'm saying that if we get the free space, then we can use our internally generated resources to build capacity to put our economies back on its sound footing. That's what we are asking for. It doesn't mean that we are coming up in arms, holding our cup in our hands, just asking for aid, and later on asking for forgiveness. We find ourselves in a unique situation. A pandemic is ravaging so forcefully, and something has to be done. And if it is not done at the right time, there'll be a spillover across or beyond the borders of the continent of Africa. Africans are hardworking, but we have been hit by this pandemic. That's why I'm making this position clear. I've not heard this being discussed anywhere. I feel that if that window is open, it will give us the space, the fiscal space, to be able to focus on building critical aspects of our education system to make it more robust. I can tell you that when COVID happened, we have seen that African countries have been exposed. Those in rural areas, for example, they don't have access to electricity. Some don't even have access to internet facilities. Some don't even have access to Android phones. How do they receive education? And if COVID-19 is not arrested very soon and it lingers into another year, third year, fourth year, tell me which country, especially developing country, can survive if some of these interventions like debt debt cancellation or forgiveness is not factored into the discussion. And I think that it's a ready discussion that we must hold, in addition to other interventions like seeking private sector support, cutting down on corruption in our country. And it's also important, if we're able to cut down corruption, we can have the needed resources. In Ghana right now, tax incentives alone cost us $2 billion annually. Tax incentives for businesses. So if you have this 2 billion, and I'm telling you that this year our education budget was about 2.6 billion, and we are losing $2 billion in tax incentives. Look at what this can do. So we need to have discussions about all these things, and all these things, when they come together, will help us to narrow the funding gap, not only globally but also within our specific jurisdictions.
Yeah, Kingsley, I think it's an excellent response and a very robust response, and I'm so appreciative of how you're showing up in this conversation. One of the things I want to do is to bring in the voice of our audience. Elder, there's a question from our audience that is saying, what about corporate CSI as one of the ways in which we can unlock private sector funding and target that towards the education sector? Would that work? Your thoughts on that, Elder?
It's good. It's good. You are bringing in this question. Just yesterday, myself and 8 of my colleague lawmakers, we sponsored a bill in Ghanaian Parliament, and the bill was to mainstream corporate social responsibility. Okay, mainstream it, have a law passed that in a way will mandate businesses and corporations to at least have a certain legal regime to commit themselves properly and effectively in supporting our economies. And sadly, that bill, didn't see the light of day. But we are still of the opinion that if we are able to have a legal regime on corporate social responsibility, okay, we then can have targeted and coordinated developmental paradigm from the private sector to supporting governments in developing our countries,
Kingsley,
than the haphazard way that
Kingsley,
is done by.
I'm going to pause you for a second, simply because we're running out of time, and I'm really keen to also maybe just hear Elder's voice on this question. But I think, as you speak about a targeted, CSI paradigm, that is certainly very intriguing. And I can see Elder also nodding on the screen. But Elder, let me bring your voice in here. CSI as one of the ways in which we can make systemic impact in how we are funding education right now.
Yes, definitely. And while Kingsley was speaking, I thought of the saying by Albert Einstein, who said that no problem can be solved from the same level of consciousness that created it. So we need to think new. We cannot depend on government alone to save us. We cannot look to other countries to come and bail us out and relieve our debt. We need to think of new solutions. And corporate social investment is obviously a very good concept and idea. And we should encourage the private sector in that regard, give them incentives, give them tax rebates if necessary. But yes, we need to get that type of investments into our education system to make it better, because we're an emerging economy, and surely we want to become a developed economy. We don't want to be emerging forever. And to be able to do that, we need to become better. And we have shown that South Africans are quite innovative, and we can solve problems. So we just have to think of new solutions to this problem and don't look at government and other countries alone.
So Eric, let me bring your voice now as we begin to wrap up. One of the underlying threads in this conversation has been about reimagining the public-private partnership. You spoke about government stepping up to their role. Kingsley spoke about the private sector stepping up to their role. I'm keen to understand, PPPs are not new in the conversation around financing. What might we need to do differently Eric, in how we configure public-private partnerships if they are going to work in funding the emerging educational medium of instruction, which is mostly going to be hybrid or online? What do we do differently to ensure that these partnerships are effective and that they actually work?
So I think first, to some of Kingsley's points, with COVID-19, it's changed a lot of our perspectives. I think it's been a wake-up call across board for governments around the world in that sense. And government is now starting to see things in a different way. So on one side, I think private sector does need to do things differently, not just saying government. I think, yeah, I've spoke a lot about government and government stepping to the plate, but in all scenarios, government usually doesn't or would not step up to the plate. But using technology in a sense and innovative ways, from peer-to-peer lending to impact bonds or some of the things I've mentioned in the past, I think the private sector can actually take a step forward in getting that done. And hopefully governments, in terms of its power, there are many ways government can do that with regulation. I think regulation is one of the big tools the government has to enable this. And if it's tax breaks, which government can give with people that donate to education, or CSR incentives that donate to education, or if it's tax breaks that government can give to investors like myself that contribute to education, or to telcos that provide internet access or data to for education services. Those incentives and those regulations will definitely help spur investments in education and help that grow. So in a sense, government has a lot of levers to pull. It doesn't necessarily have to be the budget or how much cash capital they put in the sector, but it can be definitely by use of regulation or other things that they have in their arsenal to enable investments by private sector into the education sector.
So I've got 2 minutes left, and I think the best way to utilize them is to try to give each of my panelists 30 seconds for a tweet. What would you tweet as one of the ways of just summarizing your thoughts and your views on this conversation? Now, let's remember, Elder, Eric, and Kingsley, that a tweet is no more than 140 characters. So no long statements this time, please. I'm just looking for a tweet. I'm going to go to Kingsley first because Kingsley's had the most to say today. So Kingsley, your tweet first. Short, sharp, concise, and to the point. What is the one thing you want us to walk away with in this conversation?
What I want to say is that COVID-19 has exposed us. We must do things differently and innovative in order to propel our education to a very formidable force in developing our respective countries.
Lovely, Kingsley. And of course, a bit longer than a tweet, but we certainly will make that formidable foe. I love that. Elder, let me put you on the spot. What's your tweet?
I'm going to use your hashtag, and I'm going to say rethinking and redefining education.
Lovely. Hashtag rethinking and redefining education. I don't know if you can do it any better, Eric. She's reduced it to a hashtag. What do you have?
Technology and innovation is the future of education, and it will require government support also.
Technology and innovation are the future of education and will require government and private sector support. It's a massive thank you to my panel. That's Dr. Kingsley Nyako, who is, of course, Member of Parliament for Kwadaso constituency in Ghana and former Executive Secretary of the Ghana NAB. Massive thank you to Eric Idai, who is the co-founder and partner at Virot Capital. And a big thank you to Professor Elder Duftoy of the Department of Financial Management at the University of Pretoria. It's been an absolute honor to be part of the Future of Education Summit and to take the discourse further as we work towards equipping new generations for the world of work and an exciting future. That's it from me, Zinati. Thank you so much for sharing this stage with me today.
Indeed, thank you very much, Nozipho. Well, innovation, rethinking, definitely thinking of new solutions as we chart a way forward in the education landscape and therefore the landscape of the new world of work. As always, a pleasure to share the stage with you, Nozipho. And that brings us to the end of a jam-packed and exciting day of intensive discussions on redefining the purpose of education. I would again like to thank the man who has made all this possible for the 7th year in
in a row. Mr. Rakesh Wahi, the founder of the Future of Education Summit and the co-founder, of course, of the ABN Group. And on behalf of Mr. Wahi and the ABN Group's Managing Director, Roberta Naika, a very big thank you to all our speakers, panelists, viewers and webinar guests for spending the last 5.5 hours with us. I'm sure you all agree it was an inspiring and a lively day that will influence our thinking about education as we move forward through COVID-19 to re-establish our battered economies and rebuild and improve our education systems.
Absolutely, Zinat, and of course to our webinar audience, a massive thank you to all of you for watching. Our CNBC Africa audience can stay tuned for our closing bell market shows right after this ad break.